How could you betray the only people who ever truly loved you? I looked up from my stack of contracts, my eyes locking with the piercing gaze of my mother. Linda Thompson, the woman who always seemed impeccably put together, stood there, hands on her hips. It was a question that had haunted me since I discovered the truth. Mom, I began, but the words caught in my throat. I sat back in my chair, frustrated, noting her judgment had always hovered just beneath the surface of our interactions. Claudia, what's going on? Brian's voice cut through the tension, his concerned face peeking into my office. My husband always had a knack for appearing at the wrong moments, but his concern seemed genuine, his love unwavering despite our occasional financial tensions. Nothing, Brian, just another issue at work, I lied, forcing a smile. Brian returned my smile, albeit with a tinge of worry. Okay, well, dinner's ready. I've made your favorite. I joined him at the dining table, where my father, Robert, was already sitting. He had that serene look, the one he always wore when he believed everything was under control. He was the retired CEO of a law firm, after all. Control was his specialty. Brian placed a lovingly prepared lasagna in front of me. Thanks, sweetheart, I said as I met his eyes, but behind them I noticed something different today, a flicker of insecurity. Maybe it was just my imagination. So, how's work, Claudia? Robert asked, cutting into his meal. Busy as ever, I replied, glancing at Brian. He seemed distant, preoccupied. Brian, you've been awfully quiet lately, Robert added, noticing the same thing. Brian looked up, his fork suspended in midair. Just thinking, I suppose, he said, his tone oddly strained. We need to talk. Finally, the suspense was too much. About what? I pressed. I'm leaving you, Claudia. I've found someone else, he stated bluntly, the words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. What? My heart skipped a beat, the shock pulsating in my ears. Who is she? From across the table, my mother looked down, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. The realization hit me like a truck. Mom? Linda's eyes met mine, filled with a mix of guilt and defiance. Claudia, there's something you need to know. Before she could continue, my father's spoon clattered to his plate. Linda, you can't be serious. I'm very serious, Robert. Brian and we're in love, she confessed. The room fell painfully silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. My father's resigned expression hinted at a long-buried truth. Brian reached for my hand, but I pulled away, tears blurring my vision. How long? How long has this been going on? I demanded, my voice cracking. A few months, Brian admitted, his voice trembling. My mother added, Claudia, sometimes these things, they just happen. No, Mom, they don't just happen. You made a choice, I fired back, my chest heaving with betrayal. It's complicated, Brian began, but I stopped him with a glare. You've always been part of our family, Brian. How could you do this? Robert stood up. Enough, we'll talk about this calmly. You knew, didn't you? I asked my father, my voice barely a whisper. Robert sighed heavily, his eyes filled with sorrow. I suspected, but I hoped. I was wrong. There were no words left. My heart broke into pieces as I watched the people I trusted most reveal their true colors. In that moment, my seemingly perfect life shattered, and nothing would ever be the same. The next few days after Brian's announcement were a blur. My father's words echoed in my mind as I went through the motions, trying to pretend everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. The betrayal cut deep. One evening, as we sat down for dinner at my parents' house, I felt the tension in the air. I forced myself to keep my emotions in check, determined not to make a scene. Halfway through the meal, Brian cleared his throat. I think it's time we told the truth, he said, looking at my mother. My heart sank. What truth? I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. Brian hesitated before finally speaking. Claudia, I've decided to file for divorce. And well, your mother and we're going to be together. My chest tightened. I could hardly breathe. You can't be serious, I whispered, staring at my husband and my mother sitting side by side, their faces brimming with resolve. Linda shot me an apologetic look. Claudia, please understand, she started, her voice gentle yet firm. This isn't about you. Isn't about me, I echoed incredulously. Mom, you're tearing our family apart. Robert slammed his fork down, the noise startling us all. Linda, after everything we've been through, and you, Brian, we brought you into our lives like you were one of our own. Brian looked down, unable to meet my father's eyes. It wasn't planned, Robert, it just happened. Nothing just happens, Robert said coldly. You made a choice, both of you. Linda's voice wavered. I thought you of all people would understand, Robert. Remember Kristen? Robert's face turned ashen at the mention of Kristen, a name I hadn't heard in years. That's different, Linda. She was a mistake, not a betrayal. What a tangled web we weave, Brian muttered softly, his face twisted with regret. I stood up, unable to take it anymore. You both disgust me. I need some air. I hurried out of the house, the cool evening air hitting my flushed face. Jessica, my best friend, found me sitting on the porch steps later. She sat down beside me, her presence a comforting anchor. I heard through the grapevine. Are you okay? No, Jess, I'm not okay. My mom and Brian, She wrapped an arm around my shoulders. I'm so sorry, Claudia. What they did is unforgivable. I swallowed hard. I don't understand how long they've been deceiving me, Jess. My whole life feels like a lie. We'll get through this together, she assured me. And remember, you're not alone. Taking a deep breath, I stood up. I need to face them. I need to know how deep this betrayal goes. Jessica nodded, standing by my side. I'm right here with you. We walked back inside, ready to confront the betrayal head-on. Brian, I demanded, my voice steady and cold. How long has this been going on? He shifted uncomfortably. A few months. We didn't mean for it to happen this way. Robert's voice cut in, sharp and authoritative. Claudia, we'll figure this out. For now, let's get through dinner without any more drama. Drama? I scoffed, incredulous. Our lives are falling apart, and you want calm? Fine, I'll give you calm, I said, forcing myself to sit back down, determined to hold the facade, at least until after dinner. But inside, the storm raged on. And I knew this was just the beginning. The days that followed were marked by awkward silence and heavy tension. The once cozy family home now felt like a battlefield, each meal a minefield of unspoken words. One particularly tense evening, as we all sat in the living room, Brian finally broke the silence. Claudia, I've decided it's time to move out. Linda and I need to start fresh. My father, Robert, sat in his armchair, face impassive. And where do you plan on going? He asked, his voice tightly controlled. We found a place, Brian replied, avoiding everyone's eyes. It's not far from here. I can't believe this is happening, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom, you're really going with him? Linda looked pained but resolute. Claudia, Brian and I, we love each other. This is the only way. Love? My voice was icy. You call this love? It's betrayal, plain and simple. Brian shifted uncomfortably. It's not like we planned it, Claudia. It just evolved. Robert leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You've always been like a son to me, Brian. This is how you repay us? Brian had the decency to look ashamed. I'm sorry, Robert, but feelings change. Linda added softly, and so do relationships. I can't even look at you two right now, I muttered, getting up. I needed to escape, to breathe. I went outside, and Jessica, ever the loyal friend, was waiting. How are you holding up? She asked gently. Barely, I admitted, hugging myself against the evening chill. Jessica's eyes flashed with anger. They're unbelievable. Do they really think they can just waltz out and start fresh? I don't know, I sighed. But one thing's for sure. This isn't over. Back inside, I found Brian and Linda packing up some of their things. Leaving already? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Brian looked up, guilt etched across his features. Claudia, this isn't easy for us either. Really? Because it seems awfully convenient for you two. Linda placed a hand on my arm. We'll make sure you're taken care of, Claudia. I jerked my arm away. I don't need your charity, Mom. What I needed was your loyalty. Robert stood up, his face pale but his voice steady. Let them go, Claudia. Sometimes the best revenge is letting people think they've gotten their way. I stared at my father, confused by his calm. Dad, I don't understand. We'll talk. Just us, he said, guiding me to the kitchen. Sometimes plans need to be made in secret. His words were cryptic, but I trusted him, and deep down I knew he had a plan. You know about Kristen, right? He began once we were alone. I nodded, having heard whispers over the years. Yes, but what does she have to do with this? Betrayals have a way of coming full circle, he said, eyes gleaming with a hidden resolve. Linda will soon find out that the grass isn't always greener. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Brian and Linda officially moved out, and I focused on keeping my emotions in check, drawing strength from my father's quiet determination. I could see the strain in his health, but he remained resolute. In a moment of candor, he told me, "Claudia, sometimes the best revenge is engineered with patience. Let them believe they've won. The truth has a way of surfacing." I nodded, understanding that our time to strike would come. For now, it was about playing the long game and preparing for the moment when those who wronged us would face the consequences of their actions. And so, amidst the fallout of betrayal, a plan started to form, a plan that would ensure Brian and Linda would regret ever thinking they could deceive us and escape unscathed. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of calm and hidden turmoil. Every time I saw Brian or my mother, I felt the sting of betrayal afresh, but I had my father's cryptic assurances to hold on to. One evening, after yet another tense dinner, Robert motioned for me to join him in his study. I closed the door behind us and he began speaking quietly. "Claudia, do you trust me?" he asked, his eyes steady on mine. "Of course, Dad. Always." He handed me a thick envelope. "You need to go through these documents. Carefully. These are our plans." I opened the envelope and scanned the contents. Legal documents, financial statements, and a revised will. My eyes widened. "Dad, what is all this?" "It's leverage, Claudia. Your mother thinks she's won, but she doesn't know what's coming." I looked up at him. "What are you planning, Dad?" Robert sighed deeply, a hint of weariness crossing his features. "Linda and Brian will be disinherited. You'll have control of all the assets, but it's essential that we play this carefully." I digested his words, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. "I understand." "Sometimes revenge is not about immediate action," he continued. "It's about timing and patience." "I'll do whatever it takes," I promised. Robert nodded, a look of satisfaction on his face. "Good. Now about the public facade. Keep things civil. They need to believe we're dealing with this peacefully." Over the next few weeks, I used every ounce of my lawyer training to mask my true feelings and play along. Brian and Linda got comfortable in their new lives, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. One night, during a rare visit from Linda, Dad and I decided it was time to test the waters. At dinner, Robert casually mentioned, "I've been thinking of making some changes to my estate planning." Linda looked up from her plate, curiosity piqued. "What kind of changes?" "Just revisiting the will, ensuring Claudia's future is secure," he said smoothly, gauging her reaction. Her face remained neutral, but I could see the wheels turning. "That sounds reasonable." Silence stretched uncomfortably before Brian chimed in. "Let's not make this dinner too gloomy, okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Right, let's enjoy the meal." As dinner wound down, Robert pulled me aside. "See? They're already considering their next moves. Keep playing your part." The next day, we had a frank discussion. Robert's health was declining faster than I realized. "I don't have much time left, Claudia." Tears welled in my eyes, but I forced them back. "Don't talk like that, Dad." "Listen to me," he said, his voice firmer. "You need to be strong. When the time comes, take control. Don't let their betrayal define your life." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I will, I promise." "I've arranged everything," he continued. "Mark Johnson, our lawyer, knows the plans. Trust him." In the days that followed, we had more candid conversations, often reminiscing about happier times and laying down the intricate layers of our plan. We spent as much time together as possible, savoring every moment. One evening, as we sat watching an old movie, Robert took my hand. "Remember, Claudia, sometimes the best revenge is letting them think they've won. For now." When Robert passed away shortly after our conversation, the grief was almost unbearable, but through the haze of loss, I knew what needed to be done. At the funeral, Linda and Brian had the gall to put on sympathetic faces. But behind those masks, I saw their greed. They believed they were about to reap their rewards. Little did they know, justice was on its way, crafted with meticulous care by my father and waiting to be unveiled. The coming battle was inevitable, and I was ready. The day of my father's funeral was somber, filled with tight handshakes and whispered condolences. Yet, underneath my grief, a cold resolve kept me going. I knew what was coming, and it gave me the strength to face Brian and Linda. As we returned home after the service, Mark Johnson, our family lawyer and longtime friend, was already waiting. "Claudia," he greeted me with a somber nod, "it's time to read the will." Linda and Brian joined us in the study, their expressions a mix of anticipation and false empathy. Mark cleared his throat and began. Robert wanted today to be about closure and clarity. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Linda clasped her hands tightly, her eyes fixed on Mark. As per Robert's wishes, the estate will be divided accordingly, Mark continued, handing out copies of the will. I watched carefully as they scanned the document, their faces slowly morphing from anticipation to confusion, then horror. Linda was the first to speak, her voice quivering. This can't be right. There must be a mistake. Mark looked her squarely in the eye. There is no mistake. Robert has disinherited you completely, Linda. Brian's knuckles went white around the paper. What about me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark turned to him. Brian, all marital assets are to be returned to Claudia. You'll be left with nothing. Linda seethed, turning to me. You did this. You convinced him. I met her gaze coolly. This was his will, Mom. He saw through your deceit. Brian finally found his voice. You can't do this to us, Claudia. We deserve something. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the tension. You deserve what you get, Brian. After everything you've both done, this is justice. Tears welled up in Linda's eyes, her voice trembling. After all these years, this is how you repay me, Claudia. I felt a pang of sorrow but held firm. No, Mom, this is how you repaid us, all those times you chose betrayal over loyalty. Mark finished reading the will, explaining, Claudia will have full control of all assets, including the firm. Linda's face was a portrait of devastation. And what are we supposed to do now? She demanded. Mark interjected, his tone measured. Robert did set aside a trust fund, but it comes with conditions. Brian looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. What conditions? You must both work menial jobs for a year and live in modest conditions. Only after that can you access the funds. The room fell into stunned silence. Linda and Brian's faces were masks of disbelief and fury. Finally, Brian spat out, This is insane. We'll fight this. Mark remained calm. You can try, but these are ironclad terms. Robert ensured there would be no loopholes. I looked at the two of them. You wanted to start fresh? Now, you'll get to see what that really means. Linda's voice was barely audible. How could you, Claudia? It's what Dad wanted, I replied, steel in my voice. He believed in justice. So do I. Brian and Linda left the house, their future uncertain and bleak. I watched them go, knowing that their punishment had only just begun. The tables had turned, and they would now experience the consequences of their actions. As Mark and I stood in silence, he finally spoke. You did well, Claudia. Your father would be proud. I nodded, feeling the weight of the day settle in. Thank you, Mark. Now it's time to rebuild. And with that, I turned to face the path ahead, ready to embrace the challenges and new beginnings that lay before me. The fallout from the will's reading was swift. Brian and Linda lingered in the periphery of my life, desperately clinging to any hope of reversing their fate. But I was prepared. They would learn that actions have consequences. One morning, as I entered the office, Rebecca, my colleague, intercepted me. Claudia, you won't believe this, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. Brian just lost his job. I raised an eyebrow. Already? Rebecca nodded. Word spread fast about his involvement with Linda. The company couldn't risk the scandal. I felt a momentary flicker of pity, but pushed it aside. Good. He made his bed. Jessica joined us, full of news. Apparently, Linda tried to access some of Robert's accounts, all of them locked. They're truly left with nothing. I sighed, feeling the weight of satisfied justice. They deserve every bit of it. Later that day, I received a call from Linda. Her voice was a mix of desperation and anger. Claudia, how could you let this happen? We have nothing. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice steady. You brought this on yourself, Mom. You and Brian decided to betray us. It was a mistake, she pleaded, her tone softening. Brian and we didn't mean for it to end like this. A mistake repeated over months, I replied coldly. You both made your choices. Brian made a similar call that evening, his tone arrogant, despite his situation. Claudia, let's be reasonable. There must be something we can work out. You've lost everything because of your actions, I retorted. Deal with the consequences. A few days later, I attended a meeting with Mark Johnson to discuss the next steps. As we wrapped up, he handed me a folder. These are the documents to garnish Brian's wages. Are you sure you want to proceed? I nodded firmly. Execute every one of them. Within weeks, Brian's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. His wages were garnished, leaving him unable to meet even basic needs. Linda, used to a life of luxury, struggled with the new reality. One afternoon, Brian stormed into my office, cheeks flushed with anger. "Claudia," he fumed, "this has to end. We can't live like this." I looked at him calmly. "You should have thought about that before betraying us." He slammed his fist on the desk. "You were supposed to be my wife. Have some compassion." "Compassion?" I asked, incredulous. "Where was your compassion when you and my mother decided to deceive us?" Before he could respond, Jessica walked in. "Everything okay in here?" Brian shot her a furious glance before storming out, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Jessica looked at me, concerned. "You all right?" I nodded. "Just the consequences of his actions catching up to him." Linda's demise followed closely. Her social circles abandoned her, unwilling to be associated with her disgrace. Financial ruin forced her to sell off her few remaining assets, and she moved into a modest apartment far from the upscale life she once knew. I met with Mark again, this time to discuss the final phase. "The assets have been legally transferred," he confirmed. "They truly have nothing left." "That's just the beginning," I replied. "It's time they learned humility." In a dramatic showdown, Mark and I revealed the full extent of our legal victories to Linda and Brian. Their faces were masks of disbelief and desperation. "I hope you two find happiness in poverty," I said icily, "because that's all you have left." As they walked away, I felt a sense of closure. My father's strategy had worked. Brian and Linda were left to face the harsh reality they had created, while I stepped into a new chapter, ready to rebuild my life from the ruins of their betrayal. Brian and Linda had reached rock bottom. I heard from mutual acquaintances that they were scraping by, taking whatever jobs they could find. Their glamorous lifestyle had crumbled into nothing more than a struggle for basic survival. One afternoon, I received a call from Brian. It started off calm, but quickly turned desperate. "Claudia, it's Brian. We need to talk." I could almost hear the desperation in his voice. "About what?" "You made your choices." "Please, we're struggling. Linda's health is declining. Surely there's something you can do." A part of me felt a pang of sorrow, but I strengthened my resolve. "Meet me in the office tomorrow." The next day, Brian and Linda shuffled into my office. They looked worn, their faces lined with troubles. Linda's once glamorous aura was now overshadowed by tired eyes and a frail frame. Brian broke the silence first. "Claudia, we know we messed up, but Linda's sick. We can't make ends meet." I leaned back in my chair, allowing a moment of silence to build tension. "You knew the terms, Brian." Dad was very clear. Linda's voice was shaky. "Claudia, you've always been a good daughter. Can't you see we're suffering?" I stood up, walking over to the window, looking out but not really seeing anything. I took a deep breath and turned back to face them. "There is one thing." Their eyes lit up with hope. "What?" "My father set aside a trust fund," I began slowly, "but accessing it comes with conditions." Brian's face twisted into a mix of hope and suspicion. "What conditions?" "You both need to show you can live a modest life. We work menial jobs. Prove you understand the value of hard work for a year. Only then will you have access to the funds." Linda looked like she might faint. "A year? We can't last that long, Claudia." I met her desperate gaze, my voice calm but firm. "Those are the terms. Take it or leave it." Brian clenched his fists, his face a mask of frustration. "This is humiliating." I shrugged. "It's your only way out. Maybe you'll learn something valuable." They left, a flicker of hope in their defeated steps, knowing they had no choice but to comply. Over the next few months, I checked in on their progress, ensuring they met every stipulation. I watched from a distance as they struggled through menial jobs and budgeted their modest income. It was a far cry from the life they once knew, and it seemed every day humbled them further. One evening, as I sat in the living room with Jessica, she commented on their plight. "They almost look like different people now." I nodded. They needed this reality check. Maybe they'll finally understand the weight of their actions. A year passed, and Brian and Linda met every requirement. They earned their right to access the trust fund, but it was clear the experience had changed them. They were humbled, broken down by the harshness of a life they never thought they'd live. At the final meeting, as Mark handed them the trust fund papers, Brian looked at me with an emotion I hadn't expected. Gratitude. "Thank you, Claudia. We didn't deserve it, but thank you." Linda echoed his sentiment, a far cry from the proud woman she once was. We'll make better choices from now on. See that you do, I replied, feeling a sense of closure. This is your second chance. Don't waste it. As they left, I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm had passed, leaving a calm in its wake. I had avenged my father's memory and found my own closure. Now it was time for me to rebuild, to focus on my own future, and let go of the past. I turned to Jessica, who had been watching silently. Ready for a new beginning, she smiled, her support unwavering. Absolutely. With that, I stepped forward into a new chapter, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, knowing I was stronger than ever. The dust had finally settled. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, though it was a new normal. The past year had been grueling, but in its wake it left clarity and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. In my father's old firm, now under my leadership, I focused on restoring its luster and expanding its reach. My days were filled with strategic meetings and legal battles, each victory a tribute to my dad's legacy. "Claudia, your 2 p.m. is here," Rebecca's voice crackled over the intercom. "Send them in," I said, straightening my desk. Jessica strode in, holding a thick portfolio. "Ready for the presentation?" "Absolutely," I responded, feeling that familiar spark of excitement. We'd been working on a major acquisition, one that would catapult the firm into a new league. We spent the next hour hashing out details, fine-tuning our strategy. As the meeting concluded, Jessica leaned back, a satisfied grin on her face. "We've got this, Claudia. Your dad would have been proud." I nodded, feeling a warm glow. "Thanks, Jess. We've worked hard for this." Later that day, I visited my father's grave, needing a moment of quiet reflection. As I stood there, the breeze rustling the leaves, I felt a sense of peace. "We did it, Dad. We honored your legacy." Driving back home, I felt a sense of closure. The year of turmoil had finally ended, and I was ready to embrace the future. That evening, while having dinner with Jessica and a few close friends, the conversation turned to the past year's events. "How are Brian and Linda doing?" someone asked. Jessica was quick to answer. "They're managing, but they've really changed. I think they've finally learned their lesson." "People rarely do," I said, sipping my wine, "but maybe they've been humbled enough to appreciate the second chance." Rebecca chimed in. "You've been incredibly strong through all of this, Claudia. Not many would have handled it like you did." I smiled, grateful for the support. "Thanks, everyone. It wasn't easy, but I'm glad it's over." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity and growth. The acquisition went through successfully, and the firm's reputation soared. My days were busy but fulfilling, each challenge a testament to my resilience. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Brian. His voice was hesitant. "Claudia, it's Brian. I just wanted to say thank you for everything." I paused, surprised by the call. "You're welcome, Brian. I hope you and Mom are doing better." "We are. We're rebuilding," he admitted, "and it's all thanks to you. We'd love to meet sometime, if you're open to it." I considered his offer for a moment. "Maybe one day, Brian. For now, let's keep focusing on moving forward." "Understood," he said, a hint of relief in his voice. "Take care, Claudia." As I hung up, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was a step towards healing. Later that evening, I met Jessica for a walk by the river. We talked about the future and the exciting projects lined up for the firm. "I think we're ready for a new chapter," Jessica said, smiling. "Absolutely," I replied, watching the sunset over the water. "We're just getting started." Healing was a process, and though scars remained, I knew I was stronger for it. With my father's legacy in my hands and a bright future ahead, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Life had thrown its worst at me, but I'd come out the other side, ready to face whatever came next. As the city lights flickered to life around us, I felt a surge of optimism. This was my journey, and it was far from over. Together with my friends and my renewed sense of self, I was ready to embrace the future, one step at a time. "You're overreacting as always. Can't you just get over it and move on?" Bryce's dismissive words hit me like a slap across the face. I stared at him in disbelief, my chest tightening as the all-too-familiar frustration boiled within me. How many times had I pleaded with him to understand what I was going through with my health issues? How many nights did I cry myself to sleep, longing for his compassion and support? "Get over it," I echoed, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Bryce, I'm in constant pain. The fatigue is crippling. I can't just get over a chronic condition that modern medicine still doesn't fully comprehend. Bryce rolled his eyes, his expression a mixture of annoyance and indifference. Yeah, I've heard it all before. You really need to stop using that as an excuse for everything. My hands trembled as a wave of anger washed over me. An excuse. Did he truly believe I was making up the suffering I endured day after day, year after year? You know what? I'm done, I said, my voice quivering with pent-up emotion. I'm done trying to make you understand something you clearly have no interest in comprehending. Bryce scoffed and turned his attention back to the television, effectively dismissing me and my struggles once again. I stormed out of the living room, fighting back tears of frustration and hurt. As I made my way to the bedroom, memories of our once loving relationship flooded my mind. Where was the man who had vowed to love and support me through sickness and health? The one who had held me close and promised to always be by my side? That man was long gone, replaced by this shell of a person who seemed to care more about maintaining the perfect facade than truly being there for his wife. I collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in the pillow as sobs racked my body. How had we come to this? How had the love and understanding we once shared disintegrated into this bitter, toxic dynamic? As I lay there, a newfound determination took root within me. I couldn't continue living like this, constantly invalidated and disrespected by the person who was supposed to be my partner in life. Enough was enough. I sat up, wiping away the tears, and reached for the journal I had been keeping over the past few years. With trembling hands, I began to document this latest incident, determined to gather evidence of Bryce's emotional abuse. The dismissive comments, the lack of empathy, the constant belittling of my struggles, I would record it all. This would be the start of my journey towards reclaiming my dignity and self-worth. I would no longer be a victim, cowering in the face of Bryce's cruelty. It was time to take a stand, to expose the truth, and to seek justice for the years of pain and neglect I had endured. The words flowed from my pen, fueled by a potent mix of anger, heartache, and a newfound sense of resolve. This was the final straw, the catalyst for the upheaval that was about to unfold. I was done being the silent, suffering wife. It was time for Bryce to face the consequences of his actions. I should have seen the signs earlier, but love can blind even the most perceptive of souls. Bryce and I had been a perfect match in the beginning, two kindred spirits, united in our hopes and dreams for the future. We'd feed off each other's energy, our laughter filling the air as we built the foundation of what we thought would be an unbreakable bond. How naive I had been. The first crack appeared shortly after our wedding, when I began exhibiting strange symptoms that no doctor could properly diagnose. The debilitating fatigue, the widespread pain, the cognitive issues. They all remained an unsolvable mystery, an invisible enemy waging war on my body and mind. At first, Bryce was sympathetic, assuring me that we would get through this together. In sickness and in health, remember, he would say, holding me close as I cried from the frustration of not understanding what was happening to me. Those tender moments became rarer as the years passed, and my condition only worsened. Bryce grew increasingly distant, frustrated by the lack of a clear solution. His patience wore thin, and the man I had fallen in love with slowly faded away, replaced by someone cold and callous. "Quit making excuses and pull yourself together," he snapped one day when I struggled to complete a simple household chore. "You're letting this supposed illness control your life." Yeah, I tried to explain, to make him understand the genuine anguish I was experiencing, but he would hear none of it. In his eyes, I had become a burden, a blight on the perfect life he had envisioned for us. Outward appearances meant everything to Bryce. He couldn't bear the thought of our family being perceived as anything less than perfect, even as our son Derek grew increasingly aware of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. "Why is Dad always so angry with you?" Derek asked me once, his eyes full of concern. I forced a smile, not wanting to tarnish his image of his father. "It's nothing, sweetheart. He's just under a lot of stress at work." The lies piled up, each one a brick in the facade Bryce was so desperate to maintain. We were the perfect family, with the perfect house and the perfect life. At least, that's what we wanted the world to believe. Behind closed doors, the reality was far more sinister. "You're pathetic, you know that?" Bryce snarled at me one evening after I had spent the day bedridden, too weak and in too much pain to function. "This is just a convenient way for you to be lazy and avoid your responsibilities." His words cut deeper than any knife, reopening the wounds of inadequacy that his emotional abuse had inflicted over the years. I wanted to scream, to hurl every ounce of anguish back in his face, but the strength had long since been drained from me. So I remained silent, my tears the only outward display of the turmoil raging within. That's when I knew the man I had married was gone, consumed by his obsession with maintaining the illusion of perfection. The love and support I had once treasured had been replaced by disdain and contempt, all because I couldn't meet his warped expectations. In that moment, a small spark of defiance ignited within me, a glimmer of determination that would grow into an all-consuming blaze. I wouldn't stay trapped in this toxic cycle any longer. One way or another, I would strip away Bryce's carefully constructed facade and expose the ugliness that festered beneath. He would face the consequences of his actions, of the years of emotional torment he had inflicted upon me. The road ahead would be arduous, but I knew in my heart that it was the only path to reclaiming my dignity and self-worth. The mask of perfection would shatter, and the truth would finally be laid bare, no matter the cost. The facade Bryce had so carefully constructed was beginning to crumble. As my health deteriorated further, it became impossible for me to keep up the charade of being the perfect wife and homemaker. Simple tasks like cooking and cleaning left me utterly drained, my body feeling like a leadweight that refused to cooperate. Of course, this only added fuel to Bryce's disdain. "What's the point of having you around if you can't even take care of basic household duties?" he sneered, surveying the pile of unwashed dishes in the sink. I wanted to explain, to make him understand the sheer effort it took for me just to get through each day, but I knew it would fall on deaf ears. Bryce had made up his mind about my condition long ago. In his eyes, it was nothing more than a convenient excuse. "I'm sorry," I mustered, hating how weak and defeated I sounded. "I'll try harder, I promise." Bryce scoffed and shook his head in disgust. "Save your empty promises. You've been trying harder for years, yet nothing ever changes." The venom in his words cut deep, but I remained silent, too emotionally and physically drained to engage in another fruitless argument. As the weeks passed, Bryce's insults and complaints escalated, each one chipping away at what little self-worth I had left. I found solace in my journal, pouring out the anguish and frustration that I couldn't voice aloud. It was during one of these writing sessions that Derek knocked on my bedroom door, a concerned look etched on his face. "Mom, are you okay? I heard Dad yelling at you again." I fought back the tears that threatened to spill and forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, honey. Your father's just been under a lot of stress lately." Derek didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a sadness that no child should ever have to bear. As he left, I couldn't help but wonder how much of Bryce's behavior he had witnessed over the years. Had I been naive in thinking I could shield him from the harsh reality of our crumbling marriage? That night, as Bryce slept soundly beside me, I stayed awake, my mind racing with a newfound determination. I couldn't continue living like this, constantly demeaned and belittled by the man who was supposed to love and cherish me. Enough was enough. I reached for my journal, the pages now filled with a meticulous documentation of Bryce's emotional abuse. Every cutting remark, every dismissive gesture, every act of cruelty laid bare in ink. As I flipped through the pages, a sense of empowerment washed over me. This was my evidence, my ammunition in the battle I was about to wage against the man who had made my life a living hell. I wouldn't be the silent, suffering wife any longer. It was time to take action, to expose Bryce for the monster he had become and seek justice for the years of pain and neglect he had inflicted upon me. The first step would be to confide in my sister, Jenna. She had always been my rock, my unwavering support system through the darkest of times. With her by my side, I knew I would have the strength to face whatever lay ahead. A plan began to form in my mind, the pieces slowly falling into place. I would gather every shred of evidence, every damning proof of Bryce's vile behavior, until I had an airtight case against him. Then, and only then, would I strike, shattering his carefully constructed facade and exposing the ugliness that festered beneath. It would be a long and arduous road, but I was ready to fight. For too long, I had been the victim, cowering in fear and shame. But no more. This time, justice would be mine. Our 20th wedding anniversary should have been a joyous occasion, a celebration of the love and commitment that had carried us through 2 decades of marriage. Instead, it became a painful reminder of how far Bryce and I had drifted apart. He had insisted on going out to an upscale restaurant, wanting to maintain the facade of a happy, successful couple in front of our friends and family. I had reluctantly agreed, knowing full well that any objection on my part would only ignite another heated argument. As I slowly made my way down the stairs, the simple act of getting dressed and ready had left me utterly drained. Bryce was waiting at the bottom, drumming his fingers impatiently against his watch. "It's about time," he grumbled, eyeing my weary appearance with disdain. "We're already running late." I mustered an apologetic smile, too exhausted to offer any excuses. We made our way to the restaurant in silence, the tension between us palpable. The evening only grew more excruciating as it progressed. Bryce basked in the attention of our guests, regaling them with tales of his career successes, while I sat quietly, sipping water to quell the nausea that had taken hold. At one point, our friend Jennifer turned to me with a warm smile. "Marla, you must be so proud of Bryce and everything he's accomplished." Before I could respond, Bryce cut in with a bitter chuckle. If only she put in half as much effort into our marriage as I do at work. The table fell silent, a collective tension hanging in the air. I felt the blood drain from my face as Bryce's words sank in, each one a dagger to my already fragile heart. "Excuse me?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Bryce shook his head in mock disappointment. "Come on, Marla. We all know you've been using your little condition as an excuse to be lazy and neglect your duties as a wife." The venom in his tone was unmistakable, laying bare the contempt he harbored for me and my struggles. I wanted to scream, to hurl his cruelty back in his face, but the shock had rendered me mute. Our friends and family shifted uncomfortably, averting their gazes as the once celebratory atmosphere turned toxic. No one dared to intervene, to call out Bryce's abhorrent behavior. He leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "See? She can't even defend herself. Pathetic." Those words would haunt me for years to come, searing themselves into my memory like a brand. In that moment, everything became crystallized. The years of emotional abuse, the gaslighting, the utter disregard for my well-being. As I sat there, humiliated and defeated, something within me shifted. A fire ignited in the depths of my soul, a burning rage that had been simmering for far too long. Enough was enough. I would no longer be Bryce's punching bag, his victim to be ridiculed and demeaned at his whim. The gloves were coming off, and I would stop at nothing to bring him to his knees, to make him suffer as he had made me suffer for so long. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, my mind already plotting my vengeance. Bryce continued to revel in his cruelty, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. As we arrived home, I went straight to my room, locking the door behind me. I reached for my journal, my hands trembling, as I began to document every agonizing detail of the night's events. This would be the tipping point, the catalyst that would set my plan into motion. Bryce had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and he would pay dearly for his transgressions. I would gather every shred of evidence, every recorded instance of his emotional and psychological torture. Then, when the time was right, I would unleash it all upon him, shattering his world and leaving him to contend with the consequences of his actions. No more suffering in silence, no more being the victim. It was time for Bryce to face the wrath he had so recklessly provoked. In the days following our disastrous anniversary dinner, I could feel a shift taking place within me. The years of pent-up anger and resentment had finally reached a boiling point, igniting a fire that burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. Bryce, oblivious as ever, carried on as if nothing had happened. He went about his daily routine, leaving for work each morning with a casual "see you later" tossed over his shoulder. Meanwhile, I stewed in my righteous fury, meticulously documenting every instance of his cruelty in my journal. It was during one of these writing sessions that Jenna stopped by unannounced. She took one look at my reddened eyes and the turmoil etched into my features before enveloping me in a tight embrace. "Oh, Marla," she murmured, her voice laced with concern. "What's going on?" I pulled away, steeling myself against the torrent of emotion that threatened to spill forth. "It's Bryce," I began, the words tumbling out in a rush. He humiliated me, Jenna, in front of everyone at our anniversary dinner." Jenna's brow furrowed as I recounted the painful details, her expression darkening with each word. By the time I had finished, her hands were balled into tight fists, trembling with barely contained rage. "That bastard," she hissed, her eyes blazing with a protective fury. "How could he treat you like that? After everything you've been through?" I shook my head, feeling a sudden surge of determination. "I can't live like this anymore, Jenna. The emotional abuse, the constant belittling, it has to stop." Jenna nodded, her jaw set in a firm line. "You're right. Enough is enough. What are you going to do?" A plan had already begun to take shape in my mind, a meticulously crafted blueprint for revenge. "I'm going to gather evidence," I explained, my voice steady and resolute. "Every recording, every journal entry, every shred of proof of Bryce's cruelty. Then, when the time is right, I'm going to unleash it all and watch his world crumble around him." Jenna's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and admiration flickering across her features. "Marla, are you sure about this? This is a nuclear option. There's no going back once you pull the trigger." I nodded, my jaw clenched with grim determination. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Bryce needs to face the consequences of his actions, of the years of emotional torture he's put me through. He needs to be exposed for the monster he truly is. A slow smile spread across Jenna's face, a fierce pride radiating from her very being. "Okay, sis, I'm in. Whatever you need, I've got your back." Relief washed over me, knowing that I wouldn't be facing this battle alone. With Jenna by my side, I felt an overwhelming sense of strength, a certainty that I would emerge victorious. Over the next few weeks, we worked tirelessly, gathering every scrap of evidence we could find. Journals, recordings, photographs, nothing was left out. We built an ironclad case against Bryce, one that would leave no room for doubt or denial. As our arsenal grew, so too did my sense of empowerment. The fear and shame that had once shackled me began to dissipate, replaced by a burning desire for justice and retribution. Bryce remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, carrying on with his daily routine as if nothing were amiss. He would sneer at me whenever our paths crossed, his lips curling in a contemptuous sneer that only fueled my determination. "What's the matter, Marla?" he would taunt. "Still wallowing in self-pity, I see." I would meet his gaze, unflinching, biting back the biting retort that danced on the tip of my tongue. Soon, I told myself. Soon, he would pay for every ounce of pain and humiliation he had inflicted upon me. As the final pieces of our plan fell into place, I felt a sense of exhilaration coursing through my veins. The day of reckoning was fast approaching, and Bryce had no idea what was in store. He had made the mistake of underestimating me, of believing that I would cower and submit to his abuse forever. But no more. This time, I would be the one holding all the cards, and Bryce would learn the true meaning of suffering. The facade he had so carefully constructed was about to come crashing down, and I would be the one wielding the sledgehammer. The day of reckoning had finally arrived, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Jenna and I had spent weeks meticulously planning every detail, leaving no stone unturned in our quest for justice. It was the annual Wyatt family reunion, a gathering that Bryce had always insisted on attending, despite our crumbling marriage. This year, however, the event would serve as the perfect stage for his downfall. As we pulled into the driveway of my parents' home, I could see the familiar faces of extended family members already gathered on the lawn. Bryce plastered on his usual charming smile, ever the master of deception. "Remember, honey," he murmured, leaning in close, "we have to keep up appearances. No need to burden everyone with our personal issues." I fought back the urge to recoil from his touch, nodding in feigned agreement. Little did he know, the facade he had so carefully cultivated was about to be shattered beyond repair. We mingled with the crowd, making small talk and accepting well wishes from relatives we hadn't seen in ages. All the while, Jenna and I exchanged covert glances, silently signaling that it was time to put our plan into motion. After the initial greetings had concluded, Jenna cleared her throat, calling for everyone's attention. "If I could have a moment, please," she began, her voice ringing out across the lawn. "There's something important that needs to be addressed." Bryce shot me a quizzical look, but I remained impassive, my expression betraying nothing. "For too long, a grave injustice has been allowed to fester within our family," Jenna continued, her gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd. "An injustice that we can no longer turn a blind eye to." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the crowd, but Jenna pressed on, undeterred. "Bryce Wyatt has been emotionally and psychologically abusing his wife, Marla, for years. Today, we're going to put an end to his cruelty, once and for all." A hush fell over the gathering as Jenna's words sank in. Bryce's face contorted in a mixture of shock and outrage, but before he could interject, Jenna was already unveiling our carefully curated evidence. Audio recordings of Bryce's vicious tirades filled the air, his voice dripping with venom and contempt as he hurled insult after insult at me. Documented journal entries detailing the years of emotional torment were passed around, laying bare the depths of his cruelty. And then, the pièce de résistance, the video footage from our anniversary dinner, capturing Bryce's public humiliation in all its excruciating detail. As the scene played out on the screen, gasps and murmurs of outrage echoed through the crowd. Bryce stood frozen, his mouth agape as the carefully constructed facade he had so meticulously maintained came crashing down around him. "How could you?" My mother's voice cut through the tension, her eyes brimming with tears. "How could you treat my daughter that way?" Bryce stammered, grasping for an excuse, but no words came. He was a cornered animal, his true nature finally exposed for all to see. One by one, family members turned their backs on him, their expressions a mix of disgust and disbelief. Bryce's once charming demeanor had been stripped away, revealing the ugly truth that had been lurking beneath all along. As the weight of his actions bore down upon him, Bryce's veneer of confidence crumbled. He turned to me, his eyes pleading for mercy, for understanding. "Marla, please," he began, but I held up a hand, silencing him. "Enough," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "You've had your chance to be a decent human being, and you squandered it. Now you're going to face the consequences of your actions." Bryce opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. In that moment, he knew he had lost the respect of his family, lost the facade of perfection he had so desperately clung to, lost any semblance of control over the situation. As he slunk away, a broken and defeated man, I felt a surge of vindication wash over me. Justice had been served, and the years of suffering and humiliation had finally been avenged. Jenna pulled me into a fierce embrace, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, sis," she whispered. "You took that bastard down." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but for the first time in years I felt truly free. Free from the shackles of Bryce's emotional abuse, free to reclaim my life and dignity. As the crowd dispersed, offering words of support and encouragement, I knew that this was just the beginning. Bryce's downfall was merely the first step in a journey towards healing and empowerment, and I was ready to embrace it, one step at a time. In the days following the explosive family reunion, the fallout from Bryce's exposure was swift and unrelenting. His life, once so meticulously constructed to project an image of perfection, lay in shattered ruins around him. I, on the other hand, felt a sense of liberation unlike anything I had experienced before. For years I had been shackled by Bryce's emotional abuse, my spirit slowly eroded by his cruelty. But now, with the truth laid bare, I was finally free. The first order of business was securing a divorce. Jenna had put me in touch with a formidable legal team, and within a matter of days the paperwork was filed. Bryce, still reeling from the public humiliation, offered little resistance. "You're making a mistake," he muttered during one of our brief encounters, his eyes downcast and defeated. "Think about what this will do to Derek." I leveled my gaze at him, feeling no shred of sympathy for the man who had tormented me for years. "I am thinking about Derek," I replied, my voice unwavering, "and I'm doing what's best for him, removing him from an environment of toxicity and abuse." Bryce flinched as if he had been struck, but I pressed on, relentless. "You've only got yourself to blame for this, Bryce. Your actions have consequences, whether you choose to acknowledge them or not." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him to stew in the wreckage of his own making. As news of our impending divorce spread, the backlash against Bryce intensified. Friends and colleagues who had once praised his accomplishments now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a man exposed as an emotional abuser. Even Derek, our once doting son, could no longer bring himself to look his father in the eye. "How could you treat Mom like that?" he asked during one of their strained encounters, his voice thick with emotion. "She sacrificed everything for this family, and you just... Words failed him, but his expression spoke volumes. The hero worship he had once held for Bryce had been shattered, replaced by a profound sense of disappointment and betrayal. Bryce, for his part, tried to cling to the tattered remnants of his former life. He lashed out at me, accusing me of turning his own family against him, of poisoning their minds with lies and deceit. "You're a vindictive, spiteful woman," he snarled during one of his tirades. "You'll regret this, Marla. Mark my words." But his threats rang hollow, devoid of the power and menace they once held. I simply stared back at him, unmoved by his pathetic attempts at intimidation. "I don't regret a thing, Bryce," I replied, my voice laced with a steely resolve. "For the first time in years, I'm living in the truth, something you've clearly never been able to handle." His face contorted in a mask of rage, but I had already turned away, leaving him to wallow in his own self-pity and delusion. With each passing day, Bryce's world continued to crumble around him. His once thriving career began to unravel as clients and business partners severed ties, unwilling to be associated with such a tarnished reputation. It was a sight to behold, watching this once proud man brought to his knees by the very demons he had unleashed upon me. And yet, I felt no pity, no shred of remorse for the suffering he now endured. This was justice, pure and simple, a reckoning long overdue. As the divorce proceedings neared their conclusion, I found myself reflecting on the long and arduous journey that had led me to this point. The years of suffering, the constant belittling and emotional abuse, the endless nights spent wondering where the man I had married had gone. But now, as I prepared to embark on a new chapter of my life, those memories seemed to fade into the distance. The shackles that had once bound me had been broken, and I was finally free to spread my wings and soar. Jenna pulled me into a fierce embrace as the final papers were signed, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and relief. "You did it, sis," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You survived the storm, and you came out stronger on the other side." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that better days lay ahead, free from the toxicity and cruelty that had once defined my existence. As I stepped out into the world, a newfound sense of empowerment coursed through my veins. I was a survivor, a warrior who had faced the darkness head-on and emerged victorious. And Bryce? Well, he was nothing more than a footnote in my story, a mere obstacle that had been overcome, a reminder of the strength and resilience that burned within me. The future was mine to shape, and I intended to seize it with both hands, leaving the pain and suffering of the past far behind me. A new chapter was about to begin, and I couldn't wait to see what it had in store. Chapter 8: A New Beginning. The divorce had been finalized, and with it, a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was officially free from the shackles of Bryce's emotional abuse, free to start anew and reshape my life on my own terms. Of course, that didn't mean the process was easy. There were still hurdles to overcome, lingering scars from years of torment that would take time to heal. But I was committed to the journey, fueled by a newfound sense of determination and self-worth. The first order of business was securing a favorable settlement, one that would provide me with the financial means to build the life I deserved. Jenna's legal team had proven their mettle, negotiating a generous payout that encompassed a sizable portion of our shared assets. "You earned every penny of this, Marla," Jenna assured me as we reviewed the settlement details. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I nodded, still somewhat in disbelief that this chapter of my life was truly coming to a close. For so long I had been trapped in a cycle of fear and self-doubt, conditioned by Bryce's emotional manipulations to believe that I deserved nothing better. But now, with the evidence of his cruelty laid bare and the law on my side, I could finally break free from those toxic thought patterns. I was worthy of happiness, of respect, of building a life on my own terms. With the financial security provided by the settlement, I made the decision to invest a portion of the funds into a cause close to my heart, a foundation dedicated to supporting others suffering from the same chronic condition that had once been the catalyst for Bryce's abuse. It was a way for me to turn my pain into purpose, to ensure that no one else would have to endure the isolation and emotional torment that I had faced for so many years. "This is amazing, Mom," Derek said, his eyes shining with pride as we toured the Foundation's newly opened headquarters. "I can't think of a better way to help people and raise awareness." I pulled him into a tight embrace, overwhelmed by the surge of emotions welling up within me. For too long, I had shielded Derek from the harsh realities of my marriage, desperate to preserve his image of his father. But now, with the truth laid bare, we were able to forge a deeper connection, built on honesty and mutual respect. "Thank you, sweetheart," I murmured, fighting back tears of joy. "Your support means everything to me." As the foundation took shape and our outreach efforts began in earnest, I found myself bearing witness to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The stories I encountered, the tales of perseverance in the face of overwhelming adversity, only served to strengthen my own resolve. I was no longer the broken, downtrodden woman who had once cowered in fear of her husband's wrath. I was a survivor, a warrior who had emerged from the ashes of emotional abuse, stronger and more determined than ever before. And Bryce? Well, his fate had been sealed the moment he chose to prioritize his own selfish desires over the well-being of his family. The once powerful businessman had become a pariah, his reputation in tatters and his professional prospects all but non-existent. I caught glimpses of him from time to time, a mere shadow of his former self, disheveled, haunted by the demons of his own making. Our paths would cross, and for a fleeting moment our eyes would meet, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that now separated us. But I felt no pity, no remorse for the man who had inflicted so much pain and suffering upon me. This was the bed he had made for himself, and now he would lie in it, forever haunted by the consequences of his actions. As for me, I was focused on the future, a future that seemed brighter and more promising with each passing day. The foundation continued to grow, its reach extending to communities across the country, offering solace and support to those who had once felt so alone. And at the center of it all was a woman reborn, a phoenix risen from the ashes of emotional turmoil, spreading her wings and soaring towards new horizons. It was a new beginning, a fresh start that had been hard-won through years of struggle and perseverance. And as I looked ahead, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The road had been long and arduous, but in the end, justice had prevailed. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my sense of self-worth, and for that, I would be forever grateful. A new chapter was unfolding, and I intended to embrace it wholeheartedly, leaving the pain and anguish of the past firmly behind me. The future was mine, and I couldn't wait to see what it had in store.